So welcome everyone to this event celebrating the publication of Volume 1 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. I am the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library, and it is my real pleasure to introduce this amazing volume that is jointly edited by Jeffrey Tigay and Adele Berlin. Just a couple of words about the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization before we plunge into this particular volume. It is a physical library in the sense that it is composed of volumes, but it is also a digital library where the material that is in the physical volumes is available for everyone if you register for free. And it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. What the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization does is it brings together materials, both sacred and secular, and they show you the full range of Jewish culture and civilization over the course of several thousands of years. This is the first volume. It goes all the way up to 2005 with volume 10. And I think there is a short video that would be lovely to see that sort of gives you a sense of the dimensions of the library. I can't hear. I couldn't hear any sound. Could you hear any sound?
No.
No. Okay, so So now let's turn to our panelists today, as well as the substance of the volume itself. Jeffrey Tigay has joined us, and he is the Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Semitic Languages and Literatures at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. He also received rabbinic ordination from JTS, and we're proud to be partnering with them in this recording. and presentation. His work has been really path-breaking, and it's a real pleasure to have him with us today. He's joined by Allison Joseph, who is the, okay, well, before I introduce Allison, let me mention, of course, his co-editor. They worked as a real team. All three of them worked as a team, actually, who's the Professor Emerita Adele Berlin of Biblical Studies at the University of Maryland. And she too has done incredibly important work in biblical studies together and separately from Jeff Tigay. They are joined by Allison Joseph, who is the editor of, senior editor of the volume 1 and in the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. She has academic background in Hebrew Bible, and her first book looked at the portrait of the kings. So let me now turn to the volume itself, which, well, before we get to that, I want to say just a couple of words about the actual volume. So people I know think that the volume 1 deals with Israelites or Hebrews. It doesn't exactly deal with Jews. And yet here we have it as the first volume of Jewish culture and civilization. And I think the inclusion of the volume was intended to present primary sources from the most ancient period, which is to say the biblical period. It is the period of ancient Israel, which is why the title of that is the volume. But Jews have over centuries understood this era and the Bible itself as really formative for Jewish culture and civilization in its many manifestations. So I know a lot of the material in this volume is from the Bible. How did you approach this material in ways that differ from a standard edition of the Bible?
Well, Deborah, the first thing is that we do indeed, as you say, include a lot of material from the Bible. I would say that this volume contains about 50% of the Bible. So in a way, it's a sort of like an abridgment of the Bible, but we didn't want to present our material as an abridged Bible, first of all, because people can already buy abridged Bibles, so there would be no need for this. What we wanted to do was to present the Bible in ways that would give readers something more than an abridged Bible could give them. So the first thing we did is to keeping in mind the goal of the Posen Library, which is to present Jewish culture and civilization, was to choose ways to present the biblical material as the expression of a culture, of a civilization. Mm-hmm. And that means organizing the material in the ways that you would present the written parts of any culture or civilization. That is, to divide it up into different kinds of writing, genres. So we have, for example, historical narrative, we have poetry, we have laws and legal documents, we have prayers, we have wisdom literature, letters, many of the various kinds of writing that you'll find in any civilization. In addition to that, another way of presenting the biblical material is to present it accompanied by illustrations that give the reader a visual sense of what the text is talking about. And in addition to that, because this is a portrait of a civilization as a whole, it was very important to present the visual culture of the period. That is, what, in addition to writings, what else did people see as part of their daily lives? So we chose to present a large number of color images of things that people would see in their daily lives, but we focused on things that had a kind of a visual dimension to them so that the reader could share in the aesthetic experience of ancient Israelite people. So in all these ways, we tried to have added value by presenting the biblical text along with the non-biblical material, the illustrations, and the visual culture of the period.
That's really fascinating. Could you perhaps elaborate and explain a little bit further what a reader would gain from having different texts from the same genre grouped together, the poetry or the laws, or what do you get, or prayers? Yeah.
Well, for example, one of the things that I became increasingly aware of in the course of organizing the material this way was that when you put similar things together, you begin to notice small but significant differences between them that you might not have noticed otherwise. For example, we organize the prayers, all the different kinds of prayers together. Well, one of the first things you notice is that prayers that appear in the course of biblical narrative books, in the context of a particular story, a particular individual will pray. Those prayers are always, or almost always, in prose. On the other hand, there's the official prayer book of the Bible, that's the book of Psalms. And those prayers are almost always in poetry. So one of the first things you notice is that there's prose prayers and there's poetic prayers. And one of the characteristics of most prose prayers is that they deal with the specific situations in which the individuals find themselves at the moment. For example, when Jacob is about to meet his estranged brother Esau after many years of separation, he prays to God in terms that are very particular to his situation. Mainly, he's afraid that Esau will try to get even with him for what happened in the past. So the prayer is a prayer for protection, referring to those circumstances. On the other hand, the prayers in the book of Psalms tend to be in a much more generalized and stylized form, in which the terms of the prayer are never explicitly related to the particular situation in which somebody would utter them. For example, if you read the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, what is that referring to? It conceivably refers to a person who has experienced recently, states the possibility of starvation. Either he's recovered from starvation or he's facing starvation. But in that prayer, it seems that the person uttering the prayer is expected to mentally connect the prayer to his own personal situation. So we notice these differences between different types of prayers, and we get a feeling of the different kinds of prayer experiences that individuals would have in the biblical period. So that's one example of placing members of the prayer genre side by side and suddenly noticing how different certain types are. Another example would be legal texts. So in the Bible, we have a law that says if you take your neighbor's garment in pledge as security for a loan, you must return it to him before the sun sets. He has to get the garment back from you every night, mainly because the garment, this person is so poor that all he has to offer in security is his own garment, his own robe. He needs it to keep warm at night. That's the law. On the other hand, we have in the same chapter, we have a legal text written on a piece of pottery, that was the note paper in biblical times, in which an individual is writing to his some governmental authority, complaining that he was working in the field and finished his job for the day, and suddenly his supervisor came and took away his garment. And the person who wrote this inscription is appealing to his governor to return the garment to him. So this has in common with the biblical law the idea that somebody seized somebody's garment, but it refers to a very different kind of situation. And this enables us to realize that the biblical law and the inscription both seem to be appealing to a particular general principle. And you have a law in the Bible and a case in which the person who writes the inscription is saying, hey, my situation is a situation to which the biblical law in spirit really applies. So give me some relief. So these are examples of how when you put two texts from the same genre, the same general category together, you begin to see differences between them that you would never have noticed if you just read each of them individually. So I want to add that in putting a couple of poetic prayers together, Allison noticed and called to our attention a distinction that Adele and I had not thought of before the two hymns were put side by side. Allison, why don't you explain what you noticed and wrote about in the blog?
So, as Jeff was saying, when you put two like things together, you see their similarities, but really more interestingly, you see what's different about them. So, in the section on the genre of poetry, the first two texts that we've collected there, the first one is the Song of Deborah from the book of Judges, and the second one is the Song at the Sea from the book of Exodus. So, these two passages are among the oldest of the sources of the biblical text, probably dating back to the 11th or 10th century BCE. And they are in disparate parts of the Bible. You find, the Song of the Sea in Exodus in the beginning and the Song of Deborah in the middle in Judges. So you wouldn't necessarily read them together, but by printing them side by side, we have that opportunity to read one after the other. And the things that you notice are first that they're both victory songs. Both Deborah is celebrating after the victory against the Canaanite general Sisera, and Moses is celebrating after the crossing of the sea and the escape from the Egyptian slavery, and more immediately getting away from Pharaoh and the Egyptians that are chasing them to the sea. So you see this kind of celebration of the moment. But what you also see are differences. That first, the Song of Deborah is the only poem like this attributed to a woman, which is quite significant. And Deborah's role in the story of this victory is quite proactive. She is really the agent who is bringing about the victory when the general sort of balks and says, oh, well, I'm only going to go if you come with me. So it's quite significant that she then has this a long song is attributed to her in celebration of what happens. But we also see the difference in the Song of Deborah is praising the human role in this victory. That not that God was absent, but that Deborah and Yael and Barak the general are all playing a role in this victory. In comparison to the Song at the Sea, is really highlighting the deliverance from the God of Israel being a God of war and delivering them from the Egyptians. So you see that. And then in terms of the role of women, it is quite significant. Moses leads the men in song. And then just after this long song that what you see here on the screen is a slide from the Leningrad. It's a page from the Leningrad Codex. That's only half of the song. It continues on to the next page of the Codex. But Moses has this long, long song. And then just afterwards, it says, and Miriam led the women in song and dance, and one line reprise of the song. And so in contrast, the kind of space that Miriam gets compared to the long song that Deborah has is really significant in highlighting them. But I don't want to diminish Miriam's role here because it's unnecessary to the story or even to the adding the poem of celebration that Miriam be included at all. And in some ways, it sort of democratizes it that not just Moses led all of Bnei Israel, it's a male form. So whether that's the collective of Israel or just the men of Israel, but Moses leads them in his song and she leads the women in their song. So I think that it's quite significant to, even though she doesn't get that much space to include that, but that's, you'll have to wait a little bit longer till volume 2 comes because there we have a Second Temple prayer that Second Temple song that expands on what Miriam sang.
That's great. So uh, Jews and Christians, of course, have been reading this Bible for centuries, the Hebrew Bible. So what are some of the new ways that of understanding the Bible that weren't available to readers in all of those past centuries, something that is really new for our 21st century?
We have basically two new ways of looking at the Bible. First of all, there's a methodology, which is the critical methodology, which deals with aspects of the Bible and asks questions about it, such as, for example, where did the books of the Bible come from, in new ways, and relies on not on traditional answers to those questions, but upon, I would say, evidence-based answers. For example, that raises the subject of biblical criticism. I hasten to add that criticism in this case doesn't mean finding fault. It means answering questions on the basis of available pertinent evidence and not simply relying upon traditional answers. So the question of the origin of the biblical books is something we deal with in the introduction to the volume and talk about how the Torah was composed and how different books of the prophets were composed, the history books were composed. So all of that is a methodological innovation in modern times that was not available over the course of the past centuries. In addition to that, we have a large amount of archaeological evidence that enables us to illustrate the Bible in ways that were not available in the past. So, for example, we have an inscription written on stone, engraved on stone, from Tel Dan in the far north of Israel. It's actually written in Aramaic. It's written by an Aramaean king, Aram being Syria of the biblical period. So if you look at the highlighted phrase, which was chalked in for the purpose of making it easier to see, that actually says Beit David, the house of David, which in this inscription either refers to the dynasty of King David, founded by King David, or possibly to the kingdom of Judah, which was ruled by King David. So here we have an actual reference to the Davidic dynasty of the biblical period, something that really highlights the reality of the references in the Bible to King David's dynasty. So that's one kind of new evidence that we have available. So the next thing is a seal impression, an impression on a lump of clay that was made from a seal that contains the name of King Hezekiah, who was the son of King Ahaz, the king of Judah. So this is a king, this is two kings mentioned in the Bible, and here we have something that belonged to Hezekiah, the son. So this highlights in a way that was never available before the actuality of this personality who played a very important role in Israelite history. So these two illustrations show us what archaeology has to add to the reading of the Bible. So another illustration, this is not an Israelite illustration. This is from the kingdom of Ugarit along the northern coast of Syria, north of Lebanon, south of Turkey. It's an ivory inlay. It's a panel that decorated the bed of the royal couple of the kingdom of Ugarit in the 14th century BCE. We included it because it shows a couple embracing, with the female holding a vial, apparently of perfume, to the nose of the male. And it beautifully illustrates a scene at the very beginning of the Song of Songs in the Bible. So this helps us share in the emotional connection between a couple that it enhances your appreciation of reading the passage in the Song of Songs. So another nice illustration has to do with the biblical commandment to place fringes on the four corners of the garment. So we have two illustrations that really brings this commandment to life in a way that we never could do before. First of all, it was always difficult to understand what is meant by putting a fringe on the four corners of the garment. What kind of garment has four corners? So here we have on the left an illustration from an Egyptian mural that shows people who are from the area of the land of Canaan and Syria, later the land of Israel as well. In the typical garb of people from this area, we can see their headbands, we can see their typical beards for people from that area. And the two men are wearing what I would call a kilt. And each one of those kilts has a hemline, which is not straight, but it's scalloped. And it comes to four different points. You can see each of them, especially on the left, you can see the point of one of the points of the scallop between the legs of the man, and the other 2 points are in front of the foreleg and behind the back leg, and there's obviously a fourth scallop behind him. And there are tassels or fringes attached to each of those four corners. So that seems to have been a typical kind of garment from the period, and now we understand what is meant by the four corners of the garment. So lo and behold, an archaeological discovery from a very different place, from an Israelite fortress in the Sinai Peninsula from the 9th or 8th century BCE, an actual fringe or tassel was preserved. Because the climate in the Sinai Peninsula is very dry, objects made of organic materials don't disintegrate the way they do in less arid areas. So here we have a fringe that came from somebody's garment. And if you look at it, it's obvious at first glance that it looks very much like the fringes that seat on a tallis even of today. So these two illustrations together, we have a cross-reference from one to the other, enable people to visualize the meaning of a commandment, which is part of Jewish prayer that's recited several times every day. So we have other illustrations, but before we go on to the next several illustrations, I want to mention something about the way in which we chose the illustrations for visual culture. Now, this happens to be from Babylonia, so I'm digressing a bit to refer to the objects that we have from ancient Israel. We chose objects, visual objects that have an aesthetic dimension. And it turned out that most of the objects have some utilitarian purpose. There seems to have been no art for art's sake alone in ancient Israel from biblical times. So what we tried to show was things from the daily experience of ancient Israel that would help people appreciate what the ancient Israelite reader, ancient Israelite individual would see in their daily life. And we'll see more of that later on. But I want to come now to this idle quickening instructions that Allison will explain, because one of the reasons I want Allison to explain this is because this jumped out at her as we were preparing the volume, and she really resonated to it. So Allison, if you would explain it, I'd really appreciate it.
Yes, this is definitely one of my favorite objects in the volume. It's from Babylonia in the 6th century BCE. And it's some kind of instruction or manual for artisans who are manufacturing idols, telling them what they should do. So some kind of performative ritual how they should animate the idol to represent the god, to sort of manifest the presence of the god that it represents. So the thing that about this that I thought was so interesting is because the Bible and then post-biblical Judaism really is very focused on like an anti-idolatry polemic, right? Throughout the Bible, we see all of this. Don't be like your neighbors because they will, lead you toward idol worship. We see in the rabbinic rabbinic understanding of idol worship in the famous story of Abraham in his father's idol shop, that he smashes the idols and then blames it on the biggest one. And, you know, everyone's kind of in on the joke. His father's like, you know, that's stupid. Like, of course that didn't happen. And so you get this perspective that the biblical text and the rabbis just, you know, they have so much disdain for the idol worshipers. And so that leads us to, how are we reading this? How do we see these people who are worshiping pieces of clay that were just manufactured? That's one of the things Abraham says to the old man in that midrash. You know, how old are you? This was created yesterday, and you're going to worship it as a god. And so this text sort of shows how the people who were worshiping idols agreed, right? It's not just that it was a lump of clay and now it represents a god, but rather that you need to do some kind of performative ritual in order for it to take on sort of that divine status. So I think that adds like a really different dimension to the way that we can see these the religions of the people around ancient Israel, different from the, I would say, very biased view that you get in the biblical text. This next image is a mural from Thebes in the 15th century BCE. And what you see here are some kinds of slaves or prisoners making bricks. And so I'm not going to tell you that this shows us that the Egyptian slavery of the Israelites, that this is proof of its historicity, but it's showing us that in Egypt, these building projects were really powered by a slave or prisoner labor. And that really corresponds to what we see in the book of Exodus, talking about the building projects that the Israelite slaves had been a part of. And so putting this image together with the text about the oppression and exodus from Egypt really adds some local color of that this was a real situation in Egypt. People knew that enslaved people were making the bricks, doing the building, and that may have influenced the way that the biblical story is written.
Yeah, I really love that image there with the slave master with his whip all the way at the right-hand side of it. Very powerful. Yeah.
By the way, there's a caption in hieroglyphic writing above one of those guys with whips, which the caption says, "Don't be lazy. The stick is in my hand."
That's really obvious. So I realize you've been showing us a bunch of objects from neighboring cultures. Could you sort of explain a little bit why you're into these neighboring cultures, since this is part of Jewish civilization and culture, the Posen Library is supposed to be?
Yes, for sure. So it is actually for many centuries, biblical commentators all the way back in the rabbinic period used phenomena from foreign cultures when they could help illustrate something in the Bible. Now, the reason we do that so often is that the evidence from ancient Israel covers a sort of limited period of time and a limited geographic span. The Israelite people as a people with an independent cultural existence span at most a period of 1,000 years, and a small territory that, as we often say, even in modern times, is no larger than the state of New Jersey. But on the other hand, Mesopotamia and Egypt are civilizations that lasted for well more than 2,000 years, closer to 3,000 years. And they come from lands that are vastly more extensive geographically. So the amount of material that is found in archaeological excavations in those lands is much larger because of the time sweep and the geographic sweep. So this gives us many, many opportunities to find phenomena that in culturally similar situations would resemble phenomena mentioned in the Bible. So they give us many more opportunities to illustrate what the Bible is talking about than material simply from the culture of ancient Israel directly. So that's the reason we reach so far afield. And in a number of cases, by the way, we have foreign texts and objects that actually specifically refer to Israel. So we know that they're referring to Israelite culture and civilization.
I think one of the objects you have, if I recall, Allison, are slingshots
yes, the sling stone. So
stones, yeah.
so if you think about the story of David and Goliath, this is probably one of the most famous stories in the Hebrew Bible, that David, the young boy shepherd, is able to slay the giant, Philistine giant Goliath, and he approaches him with his slingshot. And Goliath kind of derides him for, what am I, an animal, that you're coming to me with this tool? And so when I imagine this story, and certainly if you look at children's book, the way that they depict the slingshot is that kind of fork stick with the rubber band that you're pulling back and shooting. And so these artifacts, which were Assyrian slings and sling stones, on the left, those round stones would have been the sling stones. Certainly these are like military grade that someone had rounded them off, but certainly could work without such a round stone. And then the sling, instead of that fork stick, was maybe a strip of leather and a cord that you would swing over your head. So the picture on the right, it shows Assyrian slingers, and this is in a depiction of a conquest, a battle at Lachish, that you would swing it over your head and then kind of launch those sling stones. And so they could travel up to 100 or 150 miles per hour. So that the force behind that, even though it just looks like a little rock, would be pretty great in terms of being an effective weapon. And so I think with our modern sensibilities of, oh, I know what that looks like if David had a slingshot, that these kind of depictions from the historical context and the neighboring culture really help fill out the way that we can imagine these narratives.
So I want to return, thank you for that. I want to return, Jeff, to what you said about the daily life, the objects of daily life in ancient Israel, and wondered if you might discuss that a little further. What do we learn from those objects about religious practices, perhaps household tasks, the civilization at that time?
So we learn a great deal. One of the advantages of archaeology is that archaeologists basically dig in the dirt. And when you dig in the dirt, you come up with all kinds of different things, way beyond what anybody chose to save for posterity. What you find is things that were sometimes left behind, or things that were taken for granted. Nobody took the trouble to preserve. So, for example, if we're talking about daily life, the first thing we can think about is what did a typical Israelite house look like? So no house from ancient Israel has survived intact. What we have is foundations and things that were found mixed in with the foundations, but piecing things together over the course of many, many discoveries has given us an idea of what a typical Israelite house looked like. And by the way, these typical houses still exist in modern times in various rural areas of the Near East. So here are two different depictions of a house. One on the left is a drawing, and the one on the right is an actual model that was reconstructed in the Harvard Semitic Museum. So what we can see clearly on the left is a two-story house, the bottom of which consists of a work area in the middle, where you can see, for example, somebody is grinding grain, kneeling, grinding grain with a grindstone. There's a fire in the middle to heat something. And in the back, somebody is weaving. That's the ground floor. And what we see on the ground floor, by the way, is two sections to the left of the central area in which animals were kept. Those are actual mangers, an area where animals kept and where they eat. The animals are eating from a trough in the manger. What we see on the second floor is the sleeping area. The second floor in this case is reached by a ladder. And on the third floor, which is simply the roof, we see the open area that people could reach also from a ladder, where people would sometimes sit in the warm weather to keep themselves cool. So on the right, we have an actual model of what such a house looked like. It gives you a greater physical sense of what the experience would be of living in the house. But the only problem with this reconstruction is that it's in a room within the Harvard Semitic Museum, and the ceiling of the room wasn't high enough to enable a full-sized second story. But apart from that, you get a real sense. So these reconstructions give us a sense of what was their life like in their homes. So to go to a different subject entirely, we're able to get a sense of ancient Israelite clothing. Now, in that earlier illustration, we saw the fringe on an Israelite garment that was preserved in the Sinai desert. There was also found nearby an actual piece of cloth from a garment that actually has bluish stripes on it. So we get an actual Israelite garment that survived. But what we have, in addition to that, is another mural, a relief sculpture from the city of Lachish that Allison mentioned earlier. What we see here is a picture of Israelites from the city of Lachish, which was located in the kingdom of Judah, being led off as captives into exile by the Assyrian monarch. And what we see in this picture is the some clothing that the Israelites were wearing. We can see on the larger picture on the left, we see the women sort of in the center wearing long robes with hoods on them, and young girls wearing similar garments. And on the right, we see a detail of that same scene where we see Israelite males, and they're wearing, among other things, kind of short garments, again, kilts. In this case, they don't have fringes on them. And they're wearing a headdress, which seems to be a cap with long ear flaps. So we get a sense of what Israelite clothing looked like, at least in this place, in this period. So from houses to clothing, and now we have another example from daily life of a musician. This is a double pipe player from the 7th century BCE. And among the interesting thing here is that he's playing a double pipe. Beyond that, we have other illustrations from the process of education. This is, on the left, is a photo of a large storage jar from a place called Kuntilat Adru. That's the site in the Sinai that I mentioned earlier. And if you look at it, these things were about 22 inches tall. And if you look at it, you'll see that this jar has writing on it. Over on the right is a copy of what the writing says. And if you look at it, what you see, if in case you happen to read ancient Hebrew script, is selections from the alphabet. So the top line has the letters Kuf, Resh, Shin, and Tav, and then a few lines below you have letters also in sequence from the alphabet, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed, etc. So 4 rows in which basically the alphabet is written 4 times. So this seems to have been functioning, that is, a teacher of writing is teaching a student or students the Hebrew alphabet using this storage jar as a kind of a blackboard. So here we get a glimpse of the process of education in biblical times, teaching writing to a potential future scribe. So another illustration from another realm of life is an altar. This is from the city of Beersheba. And it's pieces of this altar were found, had been reused to build a wall, but it was quickly realized by the archaeologists that they all fit together and originally constituted an altar. So the pieces that were found were fit together, and the smooth sections of this altar are modern reconstructions to fill in the missing pieces. Among other things, we see points, 4 different, on the 4 upper corners, we see points, which are probably what's meant by the horns of the altar in biblical instructions for building altars. Another thing we see here is that these stones were very clearly cut by stone cutters, which is in violation of the biblical rule to build altars out of non-cut stones that are in their original natural form. So on the one hand, we see phenomena that are illustrated, that are prescribed in the Bible. And on the other hand, we see a violation of one of the rules about how to build altars from the biblical period. Interesting, what we see here both is something biblical and something, not anti, but like contrary to the Bible. It seems to be a sort of a heterodox, non-orthodox way of doing things. But we don't know that the people who built this altar thought of it as being non-orthodox. Another phenomenon from the period also has to do with worship. Now, this is a drawing. What was found at the city of Chatzor in the north was a pyxis, a kind of a box carved out of ivory with a ritual scene on it. Now, the reason we decided to use here a modern illustration is that we could not find a photograph that showed the scene clearly enough. So we asked an artist to reproduce it for us. What we see on the left is a person kneeling on one knee with his hands raised in a gesture of prayer. And in the middle, we see a tree, a sort of a stylized tree, some kind of a palm tree that the person is facing. And we assume that this is what is meant by the object of worship called an Asherah. Sometimes Asherah refers to a tree that's used in worship. In the Bible, that's forbidden in most cases. On the right, we see a kind of a sphinx-like creature, an individual with the tail of a 4-footed animal with wings and the head of a human. So it looks like a sphinx, but that is most likely what's meant in the Bible, or in the Bible, by a cherub. So we see 3 different elements of biblical culture: prayer, some kind of sacred tree, and a cherub. Now, in the Bible, those all have different functions, at least the way the Bible refers to them. But in this scene, we see a man who seems to be worshiping a tree or praying toward a tree that may symbolize something, and behind it is a cherub. So what we see here is something which is, in one sense, we know what all these things are from various references in the Bible, but on the other hand, we see something which is totally heterodox, because this person is doing something which is definitely not in keeping with biblical law. So an amazing scene that's both familiar and totally surprising.
Wow. So I'm sure you anticipate this next question, but one of the things that is hard to find in the Bible are women. They tend to be hidden, and we have to search them out. And I wondered how this particular volume of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization helps us learn something about the lives of women at that time.
Well, it shows us in various ways. In some ways, it actually makes us notice things that were in the Bible all along, but we didn't sit up and take cognizance of them. So, for example, we see cosmetic equipment. On the right, we have a cosmetic bowl, which is a bowl with a little a depression in the center in which a woman would mix her cosmetics. We also have cosmetic spoons, a long-handled spoon to use in mixing the cosmetics. And we're not showing it here, but it's in the volume. And this is a very beautiful cosmetic bowl because it was decorated with stones, beautiful stones. So on the one hand, we see the practice of applying cosmetics. On the left, we see a large collection of silver jewelry and beads that were found in a particular site that's still today, the remains of it, Ketef Hinnom. This was actually found in a cemetery. Ketef Hinnom is a site in Jerusalem, right behind the Menachem Begin Center. So this is what was excavated there. So we see jewelry and cosmetics is one example of women's life. Another example is from the Jews living in exile in Elephantine, Egypt. Elephantine is an island in the Nile, in the deep south of Egypt, across from the site of Aswan, where the famous Aswan Dam is located. In the 5th century BCE, there was a colony of Jews living there. The males were serving as soldiers in a garrison stationed there by the Persian Empire, which at that time ruled Egypt. So a large number of documents written on papyrus in Aramaic was found there and reached Europe and the United States. And among the documents that was found, there are some legal documents. So here's a document in which a man is bequeathing a house to his daughter. So this is a man named Machaseya, son of Yedanya. He bequeaths a house to his daughter Mivtachia, and he gives it to her both in his lifetime and at his death. So here we see an example of women inheriting property. Now, we know that in the Bible, the subject is referred to in the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, but it's a special dispensation. The daughters of Tzlofchad were allowed to inherit property if their father died with no son, so that the property wouldn't leave the family entirely. The daughters were allowed to inherit. So here we see an example of daughters inheriting property. The next item is a woman, a figurine of a woman playing a frame drum. She's got the drum standing on its side, and she's clearly beating it holding it with her left hand, beating it with her right hand. So here we see the phenomenon of female musicians, which is referred to in a number of passages in the Bible, most famously in the story of Miriam that Allison referred to before. After the Israelite defeat of the Egyptians at the Sea of Reeds, Miriam led the women in a circle dance and with drums or tambourines, so that they were, this was a known role for women in the biblical period. So these are some examples of how we find the life of women illustrated in a way that brings it to life that we wouldn't have had the sense of based on the biblical text alone.
I just want to add, sorry, one more thing about the artifacts and the value of the artifacts to see women. As Jeff said before, most of the stuff that remains was not intentionally left behind. So there's some equal opportunity in the remains because they're not curated in the way that the biblical text and many texts were, that they were curated by likely a male literati, and they chose what was included in the text, and then it becomes authoritative later on. But in what we find in the artifacts is it's just sort of the luck of history, what's left behind. And so the fact that women may be equally represented in the artifacts, I think, is quite significant and really important to note in what it can tell us sort of more about all parts of Israelite society that you might not get from the biblical text.
That's really, I think, very interesting. I want to ask now about dating. It's called, the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. When do you think it begins?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. It seems to begin. The period spans roughly 1,000 years, beginning sometime before the Israelites settled in the Promised Land, roughly around 1200 BCE. So we have the first recorded reference to a group called the Israelites in a monument by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, referring to an event that probably took place in 1208 BCE. In this monument, he's celebrating his victory over various enemies. And toward the bottom of the monument, you can see in the right-hand image, the circled, darkened area, which is then shown enlarged on the left. That's the Egyptian writing for Israel. And it's written in a way that has a little prefix that indicates that the group called Israel is a non-settled group. So in the context of the inscription, they're referred to among a number of other entities in the land of Canaan. It mentions a few cities in Canaan, for example. So we know that this means that this group of Israelites exists at this time, 1208, somewhere in the vicinity of the land of Canaan, but they're not yet settled there. So that's a really a good starting point. Now, if you allow some time for the references to the Israelites having become enslaved in Egypt and their ancestors having somehow migrated to Egypt, we have to go back some decades or centuries to assume that whatever was the nature of the original founding ancestors, and however far back it goes, we then start, counting from there for about 1,000 years. So it begins sometime before 1208 BCE. And then it continues on for several centuries, starting at around the beginning of the Iron Age, which we date to about 1200. We begin to see a number of villages appearing in the highlands of ancient Israel that weren't there before, and the assumption of archaeologists is that these may well represent the first Israelites settling in the land. So that's roughly when it begins. And then Israelite culture, because we're asking not only when did the Israelites begin, but when did their culture begin? What we see over the course of this volume is that Israelite culture developed piecemeal over the course of several centuries. By piecemeal, I mean, first of all, that the earliest references to the Israelites, whenever some kind of a name is used to refer to them, the name is Hebrews. And then at some point it changes to the children of Israel, which means the Israelites. And then later on, when the north was exiled and disappeared, and only the southern kingdom of Judah was left, and then the Judahites were eventually exiled as well. Once there was the only identifiable people left were Judahites, the name Judahite, Yehudi, came to be the main name used for our ancestors. The word Yehudi became the name for Jews in all of the European languages, including the word Jew itself and the word Jewish. So we see that the names of the Israelites evolved over centuries. In addition to that, we can see, and we illustrate in the volume, how the Hebrew language evolved through various stages, from the Canaanite languages to a distinct form of Hebrew, how the Hebrew writing system evolved. So all of this takes many centuries. And one of the most notable things is that Jewish religion evolves. And we've seen examples of what we would call non-Orthodox practices. And there are some that look openly pagan or polytheistic. Eventually, what there was a variety of practices sort of coalesces into a single group of practices that became authoritative. And all of that lasted several centuries. So it was a very, very gradual process. So just like we say Rome wasn't built in a day, Jewish civilization and the Jewish religion weren't built in a day or a decade or a century or more.
One of the things, since you're talking about this gradual process, is that it seems that there's a diaspora also, and that it too dates back a long time. You mentioned the elephantine letters, and you showed us those Lachish reliefs. So what can you say a little more about this Jewish diaspora experience as part of Jewish culture and civilization?
For sure. So first of all, what we see in this relief from Lachish that we looked at pieces of before is this is a battle, a conquest of a city in Judah that took place in 701 BCE. Now that's more than 100 years before the Babylonian exile begins. This means we're seeing Jews carried off into exile already well before the Babylonian exile, and they're carried off into points very, very distant from the land of Israel. So here we see an example of the very beginnings. So in addition to that, you mentioned the documents from Elephantine. Those are from several centuries into the exile, and what we see is Jews maintaining some degree of Jewish culture. They're now speaking and writing in Aramaic, a language related to Hebrew, but it was the language used by the Assyrians and Babylonians, and later on the Persians, as the official language of the empire. And we see these Jews in Elephantine maintaining Hebrew names. We see them observing some Jewish practices. For example, there are references to Shabbat, there are references to Pesach. There's even a whole letter about the observance of Pesach. And we see, so they're maintaining some degree of Jewish practice. They also are in contact with authorities back in the homeland. On the other hand, there are certainly examples of heterodox or non-Orthodox practices, the most blatant of which is that there's a list of donations. I should mention that the Jews in Elephantine had a temple in honor of the Israelite god who was known as Yahweh. That's how it was pronounced, we think, in ancient times. So they had a temple to their god, but a list of donations to this temple included some donations to what seemed to be other gods. So that's totally not kosher, but that's part of their culture. Another thing we see is that they own property. They're under the authority of the Persian Empire, but they're not oppressed. So this begins to show us something about the phenomenon of exile, which is repeated by some other documents that were found from Babylonia, showing Jews living in exile in various cities in Babylonia, engaging in business, owning property. These Jews also were not oppressed. They may have been taken there against their will, but they lived lives that were not the lives of slaves. And that probably explains why, when the opportunity to return from exile was presented to them by the Persian Empire, the majority of Jews living there didn't take the opportunity to go back. They remained in exile. So this is the beginning of Jewish life in the exile, and Jewish civilization becomes a far-flung phenomenon with a core living in the homeland and a diaspora communities spread around the world. So these are some examples of Jewish life in the diaspora.
So I wanted to switch now to ask how this volume relates to the other volumes of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. We have quite a few modern ones starting from 1750 that have been published, volumes 6, 8, 9, and 10, and all most of the 20th century. So how are there any relationships that we can see between ancient Israel and also the period that are, I would call them contemporary or at least modern periods?
So I think that this goes back to the question that we started with, like when does Jewish culture and civilization begin, and why start with this volume about ancient Israel? And so what we see at the end of the period of the composition of the Bible, so into the late Second Temple period, we see, as Jeff was talking about, this sort of consolidation of many religious practices into one. The beginnings of diaspora that then just continue. The diaspora gets bigger. Jews are dispersed even further out. And the Bible starts to move into a period in which people are engaging with it. So whether they're, for example, among the sect that was in the Dead Sea, that they are either commenting on it, expanding, rewriting, that people are responding to the Bible. And then we really see a whole genre of Second Temple literature in which the texts are adding, as I mentioned before, this longer prayer of Miriam that, you know, somebody also must have been kind of miffed. Why did Miriam only get one line? So let's expand upon that. And so we start to see, even as Judaism disperses and maybe becomes more singular, that it then fragments. And we see in the sectarian period that we start to get different ways of practicing, different ways of interpretation. And so we really see that start from the period which will be addressed in volume 2 of what's happening to Judaism after the Bible is written, at the time when it's becoming authoritative. You know, what happens to Judaism? How does the religion contend with the exile, right? A religion based on temple worship, that you can no longer go to the temple. You know, what are we going to do? How does that affect the theology? And so we start to see that. And then we start to see over time, moving from this ancient period into the modern, some of the parallels that really highlight continuity and discontinuity. So the Passover letter that Jeff had referred to a few minutes ago, from the Elephantine letters, is a letter that some kind of Jewish Persian leader sends over to the troops there in Elephantine, and tells them, you know, Passover's coming. This is what you should do on the 14th day in the evening. You don't eat unleavened bread. You know, here's how you need to do the Passover. And then you fast forward almost 2,500 years to the period of the Civil War, and we've included an account by a Union soldier who talks about this kind of very on-the-fly Passover Seder that he and the fellow Jewish soldiers put together in the wilderness of West Virginia, where they were stationed. And it's a really humorous account in which he talks about how they didn't have any horseradish, so they picked some herb, and it was so hot that, you know, some people maybe drank more than the 4 cups of wine in order to cool their mouths. And so 2,500 years apart, you have these accounts from Jewish soldiers who are, albeit in very different ways, talking about how they were celebrating Passover. And certainly it all goes back to that original Passover, and then sort of the rabbinic ideas of how we celebrate that Seder. But it's really amazing that once the collection is complete, and even with half of the anthology published now, that when it's online in the Posen Digital Library at posenlibrary.com, you have this opportunity to bring together and juxtapose these texts, not just for the single volume, as we've been talking about for the past hour, but from all the volumes, that you can pull together this elephantine letter from the late 5th century BCE with this late 19th century account of a Jewish soldier during the Civil War.
Okay, so we are actually running out of time. I have two more questions. One of them really is about monotheism and idolatry, and what does the volume show? We've seen a number of things that are a mixture of sort of heterodox, perhaps pagan practices. I think there may be some other ways also of thinking about monotheism. What did it mean, if we can understand it in the context of ancient Israel?
Well, we see evidence which is very tantalizing, not always easy to explain, but one of the most striking things is a figurine of a young bull that was found at an Israelite ritual site at around in the early 12th century BCE, which means shortly after the time that we think the Israelites first settled in the Promised Land. So this was found near the surface, or on the surface of this site. We see it is a figurine of a bull, quite naturalistic, that was clearly connected, or we think was connected, with this ritual site, which means that somehow it was used in rituals there. Now, there's a long-standing debate about what did the golden calf built by Aaron mean? What did the calves constructed by King Jeroboam later on mean? Were they meant to be an image of a god, or were they meant to be a pedestal for an image of a god? We have a number of artistic depictions of gods standing on animals like bulls from the ancient world. So does this mean they were worshiping the bull or the calf as a god? Does it mean they were worshiping the invisible deity on top of the calf? We don't know. But certainly the Bible views this as a completely forbidden phenomenon, one way or the other. So here we have an actual illustration. Now here's something else that we find, especially in the kingdom of Judah, a figurine of a female. Only the upper half really resembles a female body. The lower half is just like a pillar that the upper half is stuck on. It's a woman with her who's topless, and her breasts are very large, and the way she's holding her hands almost seems to be a way of emphasizing them. So what do we mean by this? So many people have thought that these were goddesses. Other people have thought, no, they don't have any of the hallmarks of figurines of goddesses. There's no special divine headdress. Many figurines of goddesses have a special kind of a hairdo with hair parted in the middle and flowing down along the sides to the shoulders. Those are the way goddesses are depicted, and they're usually holding some kind of sacred object. This looks like some kind of a secular female, but emphasizing her breasts. We also have other figurines that emphasize bellies that clearly are pregnant. And many scholars think that these are amulets depicting various parts of the reproductive process to enhance the possibility of pregnancy or lactation. And that these amulets were held by women, owned by women, for the purpose of enhancing their prospects to do what women as mothers would like to do. So we don't know, was this something that was like simply superstition that might have been frowned upon? Maybe it was thought to be okay. So on the one hand, we have this tantalizing, very suspicious looking evidence. On the other hand, we don't really know what to make of it. So what this shows is that the religious possibilities in the biblical period were variegated and ambiguous, and it took a long time before Jewish culture sort of coalesced around a single group of permitted practices. So these are two examples, along with the other ones that we saw earlier, a person kneeling in front of a sacred tree and a cherub, that illustrate what might have been going on in religious practice in the biblical period. Is this monotheism? Is this a violation of monotheism? It's a big debate among scholars.
Okay, so my last question then, thanks to you both, is what's your favorite examples of Israelite art?
Well, if I can mention two examples.
Okay.
One of them is the ivories from the city of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, from the 9th and 8th century BCE. These ivories are carvings made in ivory that were used as panels to decorate furniture, primarily chairs and beds. These are happen to be two open work carvings that I think are very beautiful. One of them on the left is the remains of a scene of a battle between a wild bull and a lion. And the one on the right is a sphinx striding through lotus flowers. So even if you just look at the photographs of them, I think they're gorgeous. And if you try to think of a piece of furniture decorated with them, you get a sense of the real beauty, the luxury that was possible, at least in royal quarters in this period. The next, and my other favorite, is the image that we use on the cover of the book, which is a picture of a seal impression showing a striding lion roaring with his mouth wide open. It's beautifully carved, and it has a name on it. It says on the top, Shema, Shin Mem Ayin. It's the same root as a name like Shimon, Simon, or the word Shema. He is described in the bottom part of the inscription as a servant of Jeroboam, probably one of the last really powerful king of the northern kingdom. So I love this image, and that's one of the reasons why we decided that this would be the cover image to illustrate the visual aspects of biblical culture.
Well, thank you very much. It is a gorgeous volume. I love reading through it and dipping in at different points of time. It's really been a pleasure to have you both and to share with an audience out there about the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. I would just encourage you to explore the Posen Library online, the Posen Digital Library at posenlibrary.com. There are also a number of video clips that you might listen to on the Posen Library, teaching clips. They give you some idea of smaller sections that we've discussed about other volumes in the past. And it's really been a pleasure to have you and to have all of these really rich and fascinating material that's part of ancient Israel civilization presented to us today. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.